In its first 4 months, the second Trump administration has upended the alliances, institutions, and norms that anchored U.S. foreign policy for decades, hiking tariffs on virtually all countries, at least for the time being, downplaying U.S. military commitments, and all but dismantling USAID, the United States Foreign Aid Agency. Meanwhile, as the U.S. apparently steps back deliberately from a world order that's largely of its own making, China is stepping up to fill the void. I talked last month with Sonali Corday, our new visiting fellow at the Baker Institute and the former head of USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, about what foreign aid budget cuts will mean for U.S. influence around the world. And in all of these discussions, China is a major part of any consideration of U.S. influence and balances of power and presence around the world. Chinese President Xi Jinping made a big bet on soft power with the Belt and Road Initiative, a massive global infrastructure project announced back in 2013. But there are yet other avenues today by which China is pushing to grow its international influence, like assistance, media, technology, and global energy investments. So what opportunities is China now taking advantage of as U.S. global influence may be waning? What does its soft power campaign look like in low and middle income countries in Africa and Southeast Asia? And what does this mean for the future of U.S. leadership? Steve Lewis is a Baker Institute Fellow and Director of our China Studies program, as well as a professor in the practice for the Department of Transnational Asian Studies at Rice University. His work focuses on the rise of China's digital content economy, among other topics. And he's joining the podcast today to explore all these questions and more. I'm David Satterfield, Director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Baker Briefing. Steve, thank you for joining us again today. Hot topics, all of them. Let's start with a very basic question. Around the world, China, both in real and substantial fashion, seeks to advance its interests, but it also is highly performative. China appears everywhere, signs dozens of agreements in capitals, most of which are never implemented, can't be implemented. The show is the message. Steve, tell us right now, what's real, what's different, what's the arc up or down of substantive, not performative, Chinese enhancement of their presence in real terms and their influence?
So this is a very good time to talk about this, especially very recently, Xi Jinping, China's leader, just did a tour of Southeast Asia. Now, obviously, it was planned before all of the Trump administration's tariffs actions had happened, but the timing was perfect for China, and we can see that reflected in how they described it afterwards. They described it as China is a country which is known for its certainty. It's a stable power. It's one that wants to expand equal ties, mutually beneficial economic relations with all of the countries. So Xi Jinping went to Vietnam, which historically in recent decades, they've had a very acrimonious relationship with, if not actual bad military problems at the border and on the seas. And also went to Indonesia and also Malaysia. And so these are like the rising countries, the future middle-class powers of Southeast Asia. And just as you said, Xi Jinping signed dozens upon dozens of agreements. If you talk to the experts who focus on actually the letter of those, there's an awful lot of promise in these, but there isn't actually an awful lot of substance that goes into it. The Chinese government tends to use these as a way to try to draw attention to what it's doing, to try to exert what I might call soft power. In this sense, it's like, how do we try to persuade people to do what we want them to do without actually using military force and without necessarily using economic power or coercion? If we can persuade people that we are the leader and they need to work with us, then we basically become de facto leader on the cheap, as it were, which very much ties in with that notion of like soft power that Joseph Nye, the political scientist, who ironically passed away last week, the political scientist at Harvard who came up with this notion of soft power, which is the idea that you can win through persuasion, or he uses the word seduction.
Steve, you mentioned Joe Nye's passing. Many in the pundit sphere have noted, and not in a trite fashion, it's not just Joe's passing. His world has passed as well. It was a world born out of 1945 and the Cold War. Soft power was highly successful as a tool, along with hard power, and the fundamental, the intrinsic contradictions of the Soviet system in collapsing what had seemed to be a monolithic and eternal malign presence. Does soft power still matter? In other words, Chinese soft power exercise, very prominent, global. What does it actually get for China, and how does it actually hurt the United States?
So I would say it definitely does matter because all of his works have been translated into Chinese. There's all types of conferences on it. And Chinese scholars discuss this endlessly, and Chinese officials. One of the reasons they're so interested in soft power is because they can also read the Pew Global Attitude Surveys of the last 15 years. There's also the BBC has the World Attitude Surveys. And so they ask them, which countries do you think are leaders? And actually, China and the United States for the last 15 years are viewed somewhat similarly. They're viewed as countries which interfere in the business of other countries, okay? They're viewed as countries that try to play a leadership role, not even necessarily in the best interest of all countries. However, the secondary question is, does this country actually pay attention to the interests of your country? In this case, the U.S. historically has been viewed as one that does pay attention to what individual countries think, and it tends to work with other countries. China, for the longest time they've been doing this survey, does not. The surveys in the last 15 years have looked at some of these soft power characteristics and said, what are the areas of soft power that the U.S. and China might lead in? And one of the ones is technology. And historically, that was the United States. China is basically ranking higher in many areas of that.
Steve, I want to go back to the soft power metrics in a moment, but let's talk about technology. It's not solely China's ability to project excellence and affordability in technology. It's that it uses the specific platforms, the technology itself, as a means of doing more than delivering your videos or your observations. The technology itself is viewed as penetrative, intrusive, potentially giving China from an intelligence standpoint and infrastructure threat standpoint access to critical information and critical systems in the countries. This is the 5G, Huawei, and ZTE problem. It's the problem of platforms like TikTok. So how does China balance soft power, TikTok, popular platform, and hard as nails power, a platform that offers a means of information gathering for China?
So I would say part of it is they rely on a misperception. The misperception is that Chinese companies are doing this directly under the orders of Beijing, when in fact, the most successful companies like TikTok, for example, which is owned by ByteDance. Another even bigger one that most Americans haven't heard of is Tencent, which owns WeChat, which is actually even more influential in China, in the Chinese diaspora around the world. These other social media companies in particular are very, very influential. They have algorithms, they have technology that Instagram, YouTube are all trying their hardest to emulate. But these companies really only succeeded and only grew when Chinese technicians and engineers went abroad and then also came back with foreign capital. And so it's the foreign market aspect which has really given them influence. And I think you're right. The Chinese, government can rely on Huawei for those servers, for example. But it's only now very recently that Huawei has introduced its own operating system for its phones, for example, moving off of Android. Even though there's Huawei servers in many, many countries around the world, the European Union and the United States have both identified countries that are at risk of doing this. It's mainly in Latin America, it's mainly in Africa, it's mainly in Central Asia.
And given this increasing tech penetration of a variety of different systems and platforms, how effective is the government, is the party, in using these platforms not only for potential covert acquisition of information and penetration into infrastructure nets, but to promote its message?
Not very successful. I think we do have to look at the metrics. In that sense, the Chinese government isn't very popular around the world, and neither is Xi Jinping. If we do look at things like the metrics about soft power, China does rank very, very highly in technology. Even the American Association for the Advancement of Science ranks America as only ahead of China in a few scientific areas at this point. Biosciences are some of them, but China is largely surpassing because it's making enormous investments in this, and mainly through universities. But if we look at other areas like entertainment, like political values, values of like individual liberty, things like this. Also universities. People tend to look to the United States.
And Steve, given that, the changes since January 20th in the various types of U.S. government activities or support for non-governmental activities, all of which could come under that label of soft power, it's early days, I realize. We're only talking about less than 4 months, and some of these changes have yet to fully implement. What impact will it have on any of this? In other words, are the deficiencies and problems of China so strong, so encompassing, that a drop in U.S. soft power presentation won't have much effect, or is there something else?
I think there's something else going on. And I think it has to do with the complicated relationship between the United States and China. So actually, if you look at Americans and ask them, what do you think about China? It's actually people have been improving over the last couple of years, how they actually view Chinese. And it's not too hard to think why. Let's just look at the numbers. There's almost 250,000 Chinese young people studying in the United States. Every American university student probably knows at least one Chinese person. But how many Chinese university students know any Americans? We have an immense number of just like personal individual contacts on social media. There's an immense number of like Chinese media influencers that are also operating. So it's not too surprising to see why that happens. And then add in all the other parts of the digital content like gaming, videos and things like that. It's exactly what Joseph and I was talking about, the seductiveness of this, which in China's case is hiding, you're right, a communist party, which is trying to hide its influence.
And I have to say, Steve, at the same time the phenomenon at a popular level, you just note, has been developing. Speaking from inside the government, our views have been growing increasingly alarmed, substantially increased as we see the weaponization by China of one soft power means after another, the relentless drive for at least theatrical superiority, optical superiority in the South Pacific, the challenges to Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, partners of the United States, if not full allies of the U.S., and a relentless competition breaking the rules on trade and commerce. Our view is increasingly negative, not of Chinese, but of the direction of an increasingly centralized government under Xi. And this spread of opinion, good popular reaction, very and increasingly negative and substance-based assessment of China as the primary strategic adversary of the U.S. This is significant, but my question again is, to what extent does the exercise of U.S. soft power affect Chinese behaviors?
So if we think about it, when Chinese leaders are going abroad, they're going to react to any of the weaknesses in what American leaders have just done. They're definitely going to play that up. That's definitely true. But their ability to kind of persuade people that they are a reliable alternative is weak. People do not think of China as a place they would necessarily want to go and live.
And you see a real negative consequence for the U.S. in those places where if the U.S. isn't active in soft diplomacy, even though China isn't popular, China will be able to achieve strategic advances relative to the U.S.
Yes and no. It depends on the region of the world at the end of the day. I think part of the problem with American policymakers is they're too focused on the formal aspects, the material, the economic aspects of soft power. And so thinking that Southeast Asia, for example, or Central Asia, just views China as some type of money bank, some type of alternative to the United States. But actually, Central Asia has a long-running shared history with China going back 1,500 years. If you're in Central Asia, all these countries which they see the world as hemming them in, Russia, Turkey, Persia, they see them as like excluding them. China brought them in. They could export their resources, bring them into global markets. But also, there's like 20 to 30 Chinese trains going from China to Madrid to Europe every day. They can put whatever goods. So China is the one that's viewed as like opening up and being the friendly power. Southeast Asia, keep in mind, China has something that we just don't have. They have a Chinese diaspora. There's like 80 million ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia. who historically have been kind of persecuted by their local governments for various ethnic or religious reasons, but they have a lot of influence. They have a lot of ties going back hundreds and hundreds of years. It'd be a mistake for us to think that it all just comes down to kind of economic influence, is what I'm pointing out.
Although in the cases of Vietnam and India, we do look at far more than that. We look at active Chinese threats to the literal sovereignty and territorial integrity of India and to the political sovereignty and integrity of Vietnam as areas of real concern. It's less the economic weights as opposed to you have an historic enmity that frankly is the fault of China, not India, not Vietnam, either in its pre-75 existence or post-75, which the U.S., in the case of Vietnam, had been very actively working upon. In the case of India, in the last 5 years, I would argue, the U.S. has pivoted dramatically away from what may have been an overbalance towards Pakistan towards a very strong sense that India is critical for tech, for labor, for industry, to American interests in the future. That may be an exaggeration, but there is a broad sense that India's got a vital role and that for China to have a dominant position to dictate guardrails for Indian policy isn't in the interest of the United States.
Oh, no, it definitely isn't. That's definitely true. But I think those countries have been living next to China for a very long time. And they have very complicated relations, and they would love to have better relations with us. That's definitely true. But when they're slapped with 30 to 40% tariffs,
I was going to bring up tariffs,
it's sending
Steve.
a message. That
okay.
Even like Singapore, for example, there's no tax on any American good going to Singapore. Now all goods from Singapore to the U.S. are taxed at 10%.
All right. Tariffs. I was going to raise this. To what extent, since Liberation Day, have the Chinese been able to specifically capitalize on the introduction of tariffs on critical countries where there is a vying for influence?
So they have been doing this, but to be honest, they did it long before Liberation Day. During the first Trump administration, they saw the writing on the wall, that relations with the United States were not going to get better. And also keep in mind that a lot of the investment in Southeast Asia, Central Asia, is by Chinese companies and Chinese entrepreneurs. And a lot of China's export market in many goods in Eastern China, for example, were Taiwanese. There were like 2 million Taiwanese businessmen who went to Eastern China. They've gone to Vietnam now. They've gone to Indonesia. They've gone to Malaysia. They've gone to other countries. So all of those people have known for many years now that relations between China and the U.S. are souring. So if we're going to export something to the United States, we better go through somewhere else. And that also includes Mexico, of course.
So, Steve, so much attention paid recently to the demographic trends in China. China population is going to peak. It's going to look like other developed countries, start to decline, rising middle class, yet less paying into taxes, rising elderly population. How does this all relate socially and from a standpoint of social media in China?
So ironically, they have the same discussion going on in China that they do here in the United States, in the sense that there's an enormous disconnect between generations when it comes to media and social media. So like everybody over the age of like 30 in China, is using traditional media, radio, television, all of these things, just like here in the United States. Or we use social media that connects us to traditional media, like Facebook, for example. Instagram rarely does that. TikTok also, very rarely does that. So that's why I think in both countries, there's the rise of the social media influencer. And in China's case, the Chinese government is deeply suspicious of these at the central level. It's deeply suspicious of them, doesn't know how to use them, is really focused on traditional media and trying to shove that into social media to try and get young people to play along and pay attention. Whereas local governments in China totally understand the power of social media. Like Shenzhen, the government, the city in the south, hires social media influencers like, hey, world, young people all around the world, come tour Shenzhen. These glittering, skyscrapers. We have dance clubs. It's like cheap. It's like, it's all the allure, of that going on. And oddly enough, in the United States, our local governments kind of understand that. Ironically, the Trump administration should understand this better than any previous administration, in the sense that so many high-level officials in the Trump administration are actually social media influencers.
Steve, a topic for an entire discussion on its own, social media and China. Lightning round. Steve.
Okay.
VOA, USAID, institutions for decades, their dismantlement, change in content, how important are they, were they, would they be in this whole issue of competition for influence?
I would say historically, you just can't underestimate the influence of like VOA. I know so many Chinese who didn't just learn English. They learned of political values that they never heard anything about. And that's true for a lot of the former Soviet socialist countries as well. I think the real impact of VOA is in those lesser taught languages. It's like 30, 40 some languages around the world. It's mainly going to be small states in Central Asia, small states in like Africa, where you have autocrats running and there's no other source of information.
Steve, you're a Chinese citizen, normal Chinese citizen, living somewhere in the country, doesn't have to be Beijing. Do you have access, broadly speaking, to the same range of news services, websites that we do here?
You can with difficulty. But that's the problem. In a way, it's also the problem the American public faces. We don't know what all is out there. And the average Chinese person probably can use VPN to get access to a lot of this, but they don't necessarily know what's out there.
Because this is a critical argument, that you don't need a BBC World Service broadcasting in foreign languages. You don't need a VOA anymore or Deutsche Welle, because everyone, even in controlled societies, have access to a wide range of information sources.
Yeah, I doubt that. I think what people value the most is actually competition. They want to hear multiple competing viewpoints, and they don't necessarily think that because it comes from VOA that it's actually credible, but they want to hear it. They want to hear what the official position is.
Next question. Let's turn quickly. Xi, internal politics, strength, weakness, stability, instability. How's he doing?
Well, he's, 70-some years old. We don't know what his health is like, but he keeps replacing his generals and the heads of his police force and the heads of the Central Guard unit. He's done this multiple times. So I think by any metric, he obviously is worried about controlling China.
Taiwan. I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball. Mine is fatally cracked. Next 3 to 5 years, what do you think is a more likely rather than less likely case?
I think the more likely case is China will just keep bullying. And a large degree will depend upon, I think, what the United States and also Japan and Korea do, and Australia and Europe. The last few years, all these other countries have been stepping up, sending patrols, letting China know that it can potentially work with the United States and other countries. If that can continue, I think China will think twice.
Different question. Post-Xi, how much of China's aggressiveness is a product of Xi? How much is intrinsic to Chinese economic strength, sense of place in the world, Middle Kingdom? Any successor of Xi is going to more or less take the same position or not. What do you think?
Well, I think a lot of if we talk about like technological advancement, we talk about competitiveness of the Chinese economy, that's always going to be there. Because they actually have a very similar system to ours in the sense that all these localities are competing with all the other localities and with the federal government, the central government. You've got all of these companies in these different sectors fighting and competing with each other. The reason Chinese companies like Tencent, for example, are doing so well overseas is they're being pushed out of China. That's why TikTok basically left, because they were pushed out. They were shut out of domestic markets. That happens a lot. It also explains a lot of our involvement overseas historically as well. I think that no matter who is going to come after Xi Jinping, unless it ends in civil war, which I think is actually a possibility, I think it's also a possibility that they could be influenced by Taiwanese democracy. I wouldn't be surprised if you think about the history of the Soviet Union or in the Eastern European states is in many cases the Communist Party decided to compete in elections, and they usually lost.
Steve, does the outcome in Ukraine truly matter in Xi's calculus? We say it does. What's your sense?
I don't have a good sense for that. I would say if you're Xi Jinping right now, you want to have good relations with Russia because Russia needs you. You can also get some energy a lot cheaper right now. Everything's working in China's favor. And also, after Putin goes, maybe they can reclaim the parts of Siberia that Russia took from them.
That's a radical thought.
It's not radical in China.
Final question. Put yourself in Xi's mind right now as you sit in Beijing. You've watched the U.S. declare in a eye-watering, head-spinning sense, 145% tariffs. Now it's 30% with exclusions. What conclusions are you drawing?
I think that they look at President Trump and American power much like they saw during the first Trump administration. They've always been actually very comfortable with President Trump, probably because they have their worldview is very, very similar, which is we don't trust anything multilateral. Everything must be bilateral because then we can throw our weight in and we can bully people. And so they actually just see the U.S. as a bigger bully. Starting 10, 15 years ago, Chinese scholars from Chinese think tanks would come up to me and say, we want to work with you on what we call big power relations. What it means is how can the U.S. and China work together to collectively bully the rest of the world into getting what both of us want?
A reversion back, sort of, to a pre-1945 world. Bigger powers can do bigger things, and there are only a few of those bigger powers out there. Steve, there are many topics here which will merit further discussion, and I look forward to that. Thank you very much for being here. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zamel with support from Maggie Siganova. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thank you for listening.